Okay, we're live.
Ah. Hallo, herzlich willkommen.
Herzlich willkommen zur vorerst letzten Veranstaltung der Veranstaltungsreihe The Red Thread der China AG des Kulturraum e.V. Heute widmen wir uns der Neuen Seidenstraße, einem gigantischen Handelsrouten- und Infrastrukturprojekt, welches sich von China über die Mongolei, Russland, Zentralasien, Westasien, Europa, Afrika, also sozusagen 2/3 der Weltbevölkerung betrifft und eben durch diese ganzen Regionen durchzieht. Wir danken der Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung für die Finanzierung dieser Veranstaltung, der Honorare. Und
genau, wichtig ist zu wissen, diese Veranstaltung heute läuft komplett auf Englisch. Peter aus der China AG wird gleich die beiden heutigen Referentinnen vorstellen. Das wird er auf Englisch tun, damit Sie das auch verstehen. Ihr könnt euch Fragen aber natürlich auch auf Deutsch stellen, wenn ihr das möchtet, oder auf Englisch. Nutzt dazu bitte die Chat-Funktion im YouTube-Livestream. Das geht aber nur, wenn ihr angemeldet seid. Sonst habt ihr die Möglichkeit, bei Twitter uns Fragen zu stellen, oder es ist auch möglich, uns eine E-Mail zu schicken. Die wird jetzt eventuell hier in den Kommentaren jetzt auftauchen. Falls jetzt nicht bei YouTube in den Kommentaren auftaucht, dann lautet die E-Mail, an die ihr die Fragen schreiben könnt, the_red_thread mit D _Leipzig@protonmail.com. Und da könnt ihr die Fragen hinschicken und dann werden die eventuell übersetzt und gehen dann an die Referentinnen. So, wir wünschen euch jetzt viel Spaß
und sehen uns am Ende der Veranstaltung nochmal und übergeben das Moderationszepter an Peter.
Thank you, Caro and Magda, for the introduction. I'm Peter and I will moderate this evening. Also from my part, I want to welcome everyone in the online audience and especially want to thank or welcome our two guests, Runya Qiaoan and Solveig Qu Suess for today. Hello, good evening and Happy New Year. And want to welcome you for the final event of our series, The Red Thread, today on the topic of the Belt and Road Initiative. I would like to start with some structural aspects. As Caro and Magda already mentioned, we want to thank the Rosa-Luxemburg Stiftung Sachsen for supporting this event, and also want to thank explicitly the Mona Lisa Feminist Library for being able to use their infrastructure. As already mentioned and announced, the evening will be conducted in English. If you have any questions or remarks, you can post them at any time in the YouTube chat or via Twitter. You can find a link in the YouTube description. It is, of course, also possible to ask questions in German, and they will be translated and relayed to me and the guests. I will now give a short overview of the structure of this evening. At first, I will say a few introductory words on the topic of this evening, the Belt and Road Initiative, and we'll introduce our guests in the process. After that, Runya Qiaoan will share with us her research in her talk titled Digital Populism, the Legitimation of the Belt and Road Initiative by China's Party Media. That will last about 20 to 30 minutes. After that, we will take some time for direct questions, and we'll then proceed with Solveig Qu Suess' lecture performance titled Overland, There is Shorter Time to Dream, which lasts about more or less 30 minutes. And after that, we will then enter into the discussion, and are very happy to take up questions from the audience. And are looking forward to a lively discussion. So that all in all, we try to wrap up around 9 p.m. So you have a bit of a feeling, and you can see how the discussion goes. I would like to start, and I will, by sharing my screen. with a short introduction to the topic of tonight, namely the Belt and Road Initiative. Throughout the series, The Red Thread, we have attempted to give an introductory insight on a range of topics that are more or less visible in contemporary discussions surrounding the People's Republic of China. The motivation was that we observed that those discussions, including in circles that understand themselves as progressive, often remain at best very generalistic, unnuanced, or underinformed of the actual situation, and at worst reproduce Eurocentric cultural cliches and stereotypical simplifications that forego the complex realities of the PRC, the People's Republic, and its manifold entanglement in global networks, economical, political, and cultural. This is all the more true in regard to the topic of today, namely the Belt and Road Initiative, or New Silk Road, the public discussion of which often reminds of Cold War era friend or foe schemes. Here, the series and this event are an attempt to offer different perspectives from and on these topics that allow for a more serious and critical engagement with those entanglements. But what is the Belt and Road? Because we weren't sure that everybody in the audience knows, and I think this question alone could fill hours of discussion. But the brief answer would be that the Belt and Road Initiative can be described as an economic and foreign policy initiative, an umbrella designation for hundreds of infrastructure projects financed and constructed in part or in whole by Chinese entities in lands far beyond China's borders. It was launched in 2013 by Chinese President Xi Jinping, then still under the name One Belt, One Road, and is also commonly known as the New Silk Road, mirroring its ambition to set up a contemporary expansion of the historical trade routes connecting East and West under the aegis of economic development. The overland component to connect the country to Europe through Central Asia has been dubbed the Silk Road Economic Belt, here in red, while the second leg, the road, here in blue, is to build a 21st century maritime Silk Road connecting China's southern provinces through ports and railways with the Indian Ocean from Southeast Asia all the way to East Africa and parts of Europe. The skeleton of the initiative are 6 main economic corridors, as can be seen on the map here, but it extends to projects in currently over 160 countries. I invite you now to have a look at these stills from an official Belt and Road sing-along video, the PRC's official news outlet, which enters into the discussion of, I think, a few valuable notions to think about the framework. Alluding to the historical Silk Road, Chinese official discourse heralds its purpose as to kindle a new era of globalization, a golden age of commerce that will benefit all under the buzzword of connectivity. But how? Connectivity is increased through the construction of infrastructure, including logistical hubs such as ports, airports, rail lines, utilities, industrial centers, deep water ports, highways, and even entire new smart cities and urban sectors. The initiative encompasses, on the one hand, a whole array of different actors, from province and city government, state-owned and global private companies, including banks, scientific research institutions, and universities, to, on the other hand, regulatory systems that are put in place to support these corporations. For example, in the frame of multilateral institutions and bilateral corporations, such as the New Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. These multinational institutions are intended as an alternative or at least complementary to existing financial institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF. The proclaimed aim of the initiative is to seek new models of international cooperation and global governance, promoting orderly and free flow of economic factors, and by doing so, ushering in a new era of common development and enhanced connectivity, and with Chinese help, forging a, I quote, community of common human destiny, end quote. Especially since the presidency of Donald Trump and growing economic protectionism, China puts forward the BRI as a guarantee of stability for the globalized economy. The BRI has been written into the constitution of the Chinese Communist Party and is conceived of as a multi-purpose umbrella for foreign policy and domestic development. While it is often framed in Western media and political discourse as a mainly political project to accomplish superpower dominance, it is important to note that the BRI does help China meet some of its most pressing economic challenges and challenges these economic factors pose for the political legitimacy of the Communist Party rule. Some of these economic challenges are, for example, encouraging regional development in China through better integration with neighboring economies. So the desire to integrate those to create new markets and make them, quote, productive and efficient, with all that entails and implies for existing practices and cultures. The input of Solveig Qu Suess will go into this deeper later in regard of Xinjiang. Another challenge that the BRI seeks to address is the problem of access capacity, so that the new Silk Road offers a lucrative outlet to allow Chinese manufacturing to swing towards higher end industrial goods. And last but not least, it entails the attempt to upgrade Chinese industry and using the BRI to export and internationalize China's technological, industrial, engineering, and legal standards. Now here, it is important to note that there are, however, no strict criteria, and the BRI is generally rather used as a loose brand, a banner that hangs over a wide and ever-expanding list of activities, such as BRI fashion shows, concert, and art exhibits. However, for an initiative so politically important, vast in scope, and so frequently discussed, there is comparatively little consideration of the discursive shifts, the changing meaning of the BRI as signifier within China, as well as the physical realities of the BRI. After all, the meat and bones of the BRI is hard infrastructure and the soft connectivity, the policies and regulatory system that facilitate its use. So how to grasp the BRI beyond stereotypical descriptions? What strategies are used to foment support for the BRI? What role do these play? How to understand the ways in which the infrastructure generated in the framework of the BRI implies a reordering of time and space, and what are its implications locally as much as globally? What is being made visible and invisible in the process? Here, we are happy to introduce our guests for tonight to give an insight into particular aspects in the framework of this topic from their respective research practices. And I would like now to introduce our guests more elaborately. We warmly welcome Runya Qiaoan. She is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Asian Studies at the Palacky University in Olomouc, Czech Republic, a research associate at the Central European Institute of Asian Studies, and since 2018 participating in a 3-year research project on Belt and Road Initiative, supported by the Czech Science Foundation. She holds a BA in philosophy from Runya Qiaoan University in Guangzhou, PRC, and an MA and PhD in sociology from Masaryk University in Brno. Recent articles are, for example, The Politics of Blaming, the narrative battle between China and the US over COVID-19 in the Journal of Chinese Political Science, The Myth of Masks, a tale of risk selection in the COVID-19 pandemic in Social Anthropology, Critical Cultural Discourse Analysis, a case study of Chinese official discourse on civil society in the Routledge Handbook of Chinese Discourse Analysis. Solveig Qu Suess' work focuses on embodied and ecological politics across infrastructural environments through documentary making, research, and writing. Her practice engages us with how circuits of trade, information, and climates are inextricably tied to the politics of capital, power, and control. Her inaugural film, AAA Cargo, is a documentary essay on the New Silk Road, where government efforts to speed up trade collide with more than human choreographies of materials. Solveig collaborates with Asia Basdrieva on geocinema, through which they research how environmental sensing has articulated Earth transformations, using expanded cinema as a method to investigate aesthetics in geopolitical systems. Solveig was a former Digital Earth Fellow, holds a master's from the Center of Research Architecture at the Goldsmiths University London, and is currently a PhD researcher with the Cycles of Circulation project at Critical Media Lab in Basel. Her work has been exhibited worldwide, including Rotterdam International Film Festival, Images Festival Toronto, Art Science Museum Singapore, ZKM Karlsruhe, and Kunsthalle Trondheim. In 2020, GeoCinema was nominated for the Regierung Stiftung Award for Artistic Research. Welcome again to you both. And I would propose that if you're ready, Runya, you can start with your lecture. We're looking forward.
Okay, thank you, Peter, for the introduction. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to join this discussion at a special time. It's Chinese New Year Eve now, actually. Yeah, it kind of feels special for me to talk about the Chinese digital populism in this special time. Well, yeah, Peter just gave a brilliant introduction on Belt and Road, which is which you have seen that how Chinese government actually tried very hard to persuade the international audience about this political program and how it can benefit the whole world. So my talk takes a kind of a different angle. I will focus on how Chinese government try to persuade its own people, Chinese people, about this very costly grand strategy in China. Okay, so without further ado, I will share my PowerPoint and start my talk. Okay, So my talk is about digital populism in the authoritarian context, the legitimization of the Belt and Road Initiative by Chinese party media. This talk is based on research I did with PhD students from my former university. So first of all, I would like to clarify this concept, digital populism. So what is populism? This is a very debated concept. And I take it from two perspectives. First of all, it is rhetorically a communicative mode that is plain spoken, sometimes aggressive, but appealing to the common sense. And ideologically, it kind of takes the stance that virtue resides in the simple people. Digital populism, to put it simple, is this form of political expression conducted through digital platforms. I guess many of you are pretty familiar with digital populism already, because maybe your state leader are actually using these tactics already, communicating with your people, and if not, at least that we can see Donald Trump as a quite perfect example of digital populism, and how he used Twitter, use this plain or even sometimes vulgar language to appeal to the public. Okay, so even though it is widely observed and practiced in the democratic context, and many people would think that in the authoritarian context, such thing doesn't exist. Like, people would imagine that in Red China, like, the government still use very hard propaganda strategy to influence its citizens. Is it true? So in this talk, I would like to show that in the authoritarian context, at least in the 21st century, the government also needs to communicate with its citizens in a more popular rhetoric style to gain support and to strengthen its legitimacy. So here I ask these questions. What discursive strategies does Chinese party state use to legitimize its political program? And what newly emerging trend in propaganda do these discursive strategies indicate? And how is digital populism performed in this case? Here I use Belt and Road as a case study. So Peter has already introduced what this project is. So I will just very quickly go through some recaps. Yeah, so basically it's like a very ambitious effort to improve regional cooperation and connectivity on a transcontinental scale. And it includes basically, I mean, you can say 2 routes, but actually it's more complex, and the map is also diversified. You see different versions because it's still an emerging, developing kind of project, right? Yeah, so but basically there are 2 major parts. One is the overland route, or the Silk Road economic belt, which is, you can see in my version of the map, it's the dark blue road on the top. And then another part is the sea route, or the 21st century maritime Silk Road, which is a light route across Southeast Asia and so on. Okay. And this initiative was proposed by Chinese President Xi Jinping in 2013, and until 2018, it already covers like two-thirds of the world's population, and almost half of the global GDP. So it's really big and costly. So to be honest, the Chinese government spent tons of money on this project. Every year there are international summits, they invite international experts and so on to come to Beijing, and also like a lot of investment going on all over the world. Well, as you all know, being the 2nd biggest economy, but China actually still have a lot of poor region, and it itself has a big challenge to lift its people, some parts of its people, out of poverty, right? So the government has to persuade its own people why it makes sense to invest in such project rather than to just focus on domestic issues, right? So this is like the interesting issue I would, I've kind of focused on, and I want to answer this question: how does Chinese government do it? And so another thing I would like to clarify at the beginning as a background information is about the new media development in China. So China has topped the world in number of citizens since 2008. And in 2018, China accounted for over 1/5 of internet users worldwide. And in the first quarter of 2020, the number of Chinese internet users has reached over 900 million. So in such context, the Chinese party media or the Chinese party state is very aware of the importance of using new media to communicate with its people. The Chinese president Xi Jinping himself has given this clear guidance on the party state media should transform itself. So he said in 2016 that the party media must reform the discursive system to construct a discourse field that is adapted to the habit of netizens and channel the official and civil fields. Yeah, and a very kind of good illustration of such kind of hybrid of the official and the civil is this kind of a sock puppet account or dummy account or alias, or there are many ways to translate this term 马甲号 in Chinese. So it's essentially a kind of official media account existing on social media, but it's dressed up as an official media account. So one of the most successful of such account is called 侠客岛, and 侠客岛 is affiliated with People's Daily. Maybe some of you know that People's Daily is actually the newspaper of Chinese Communist Party Central Committee. Yeah, so it's really the mouthpiece of the Chinese Communist Party. But it kind of established this kind of trendy, hip looking social media account online, which doesn't use like People's Daily in its name at all, right? So this is the account I will focus on. And I chose the articles, the reports in these social media accounts, and I use Belt and Road as the keywords to collect all the sentences, which includes either like 一带一路 this term, Belt and Road, or Silk Road, 丝绸之路 this term. And basically the time frame is since 2014, when the account was established, to 2019. That's when this research was finished. So at the end, we collected 81 articles and over 300 sentences. And so due to time limits, I will only show you the small fraction of the examples in the later analysis. Okay, the methodology here I use is basically critical discourse analysis. I follow the three-dimensional framework from Fairclough. So first of all, there's this micro-level analysis focusing on the linguistic features in the articles. And then it also covers the meso level, which is the production and conception of the text. And last but not least, it also focuses on the macro level, which is the socio-cultural practice of the text. And I also borrow this concept of empty signifier from Laclau and Moff. So empty signifier is essentially a type of signifier that is not tied to a necessary or a natural signified. And because of its fluidity, it can be used to justify different claims to serve different purposes. Okay, so first of all, I will start with the meso level analysis, which is the discourse practice, like the production and distribution of the text. So here, the production team of the Xiakedao account, as I said, is a kind of sock puppet dummy alias account, which is affiliated with the party official media, but dressed up as more independent account. Okay, so its founders are 5 young people, average 30 years old, from the People's Daily Overseas edition. And one interesting feature is that each of them have a kind of pen name borrowed from or kind of resemble the wuxia heroes from the wuxia novels. Okay, so and also the Xiakedao, this name itself is borrowed from Jin Yong's wuxia novel. So for some of you who are familiar with Chinese culture, I guess you already know this author, Jin Yong. Like he's one of the most famous author who is writing about kind of ancient, like the, how to say, like kind of novels, and his charm is that he's able to appeal both to the highbrow and the lowbrow readers. And this term xia in Chinese culture stands for the swordsmen who hold their ideals and defend justice. And Xiakedao can be translated directly as Swordsman's Island. So it shows that this name kind of shows that Xiakedao, this public account, is a place where these rightful swordsmen gather. So they are meant to defend justice and represent a right voice or something like that. And okay, so this even though these founders, these major writers of Xiakedao claim that they manage this account only during their off time, like when they finish their daily work, then they turn to this account. But actually, they are very impressively active and successful. And so they have basically on average over 80,000 reads per article, and its impact kind of exceeds 99% of public accounts on WeChat. And it also attracts some, let's say, important readers, like not only some civil servants and university teachers and overseas Chinese would say that they're reading it, and even Chinese ambassador in Spain claims to be his reader, and what is even more shocking, like Xiakedao published one article with the title that Xi Jinping asked them, that Xi Jinping is a Chinese president. He asked them, so are you the one who is running Xiakedao? I read it often. So this shows that they even catch the attention of the top leader in China. So due to this its success and its popularity, and we chose it as a kind of a case study, an example to show you how the party media communicate with citizens in this kind of account. Okay, And another thing about the about Xiakedao is that it remains a quite high frequency. It basically publishes 1 to 2 articles per day, and it's also very interactive with its readers. It has WeChat groups to maintain a close relation with its readers, and there are often over 3,000 fans in permanent groups. It also has a lot of contemporary, not contemporary, many temporary themes groups, and it also comments and replies to readers often. And so in this way, Xiakedao formed a kind of organic circle of production, distribution, and consumption. And so its readers feel that it actually is forming and participating in the production of the articles. And so they feel close with the account. And that's how it kind of remained this kind of success among the many competing public accounts. And now let's move to the micro level, the linguistic or textual analysis of Xiakedao. So in this part, I would like to first focus on some of the headlines, the titles of the articles. So here there are 3 examples. I would call them the typical clickbait titles. So the first one you can see, it says, "This country is the first G7 member who joins the BRI. Why is it?" So after reading this title, your first reaction will be this country, which country, right? So it kind of steer the reader's curiosity. The second title, similarly, it says that many countries and people's concern for BRI is beyond our imagination. So many countries, like which countries, right? Again, it kind of hides the answer. And then also this term, beyond our imagination, it sounds very exciting. You want to see how much they actually care about BRI, right? Yeah. And the third title, America wants to launch the trade war, but some countries run to China to talk about cooperation. Yeah, similarly, again, it kind of doesn't give you the answer in the title. It just says some countries. Which countries you would like to know? You kind of get attracted, you click on it, right? Yeah, that's how it kind of really get this high amount of at least click. Yeah, and it really resembles some of the clickbait articles you will see on your social media account, I guess. Yeah. And now I would like to focus on another kind of rhetoric technique it uses to attract readers, especially I would say the young readers. And so one of the things is that it likes to use very playful analogy, like in its articles. Like, let's look at this paragraph. So it basically says that 2 days before the summit, the United States confirmed that it has sent delegation to participate in the BRI summit. And the situation was completely reversed. Also, attending the summit does not necessarily mean that the United States will participate in the BRI cooperation. This at least signals a possibility of future development. Just like if a girl agreed to have dinner and watch movie with you, then there's a chance. So you wouldn't expect such playful analogy of dating to appear in a very serious article which introduces the cooperation or the potential cooperation between China and the United States on Belt and Road Initiative. And such thing doesn't appear in traditional Chinese media. Yeah. Yeah, but these kind of things happen very often in Xiakedao article. Yeah, in this one, it basically shows that BRI is a very popular initiative, and which made U.S. changing its attitude. And also this analogy, dating analogy, kind of shows that China and US are two equal partners. Yeah, which also shows the confidence and so on of current Chinese people, I guess. Another rhetoric technique is the use of popular colloquial vocabulary. Like here, it says that this writer, he called himself Uncle Dao. He said, I try to play the BRI video game. It's a kind of a video game developed to make people get more familiar with what the BRI project is, and so on. So he said that I not only succeeded in becoming the prettiest boy on the new channel, but also blah, 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 blah. Okay, so here it used this succeed in becoming, it used this term, 成功上位. That's kind of a term. Again, you don't see these kind of terms in the traditional official media, the socialist style media, not at all. It's more like a slang language used among teenagers, let's say, and also this prettiest boy use this term 最靓的仔. It's also one of the trendy terms in those time. Yeah, so this one also, it used this kind of term to attract young readers, and after reading this paragraph, you get this impression that BRI is very successful, and it has achieved initial achievements already. And another thing I would like to show you is how Xia Kedao used the very personalized storytelling to communicate with its readers. For example, it used this term Uncle Dao, Dao Shu, Sister Dao, Dao Mei, or Dao Friends, Dao You, to kind of, like the first two terms are the authors referring to themselves, like it's a male, and he kind of feel he's a little bit older. He call himself Uncle Dao. Okay, but female, a little bit younger, he call she call herself Sister Dao. And then the readers are Dao friends. Yeah. So in this paragraph, it says that in the street of Serbia, Uncle Dao passed by a group of junior high school students, excitingly waving and saying ni hao, hello in Chinese, right? And in the New Year video we collected last year, many Dao friends, reader of the Xia Kedao, worked in overseas BRI project, sent blessings where local friends. Yeah, so this paragraph also, it sounds very how to say, informal, and also very close with its readers. Yeah, and after reading this, you get the impression that BRI is widely welcomed in like abroad, in Serbia in this case, but abroad basically in general, like people are welcoming Chinese project. It kind of deliver this kind of impression through this paragraph. Another kind of feature of Xia Kedao's language is that it also uses many interesting metaphors. Like here, it used the metaphor of fast ride, 快车, and free ride, 顺风车. So here it says that under these circumstances, participating in China's BRI, taking a ride on China's Development Express, and taking a free ride on China's car, tackling Italy's trade deficit, they will necessarily unleash Italy's development potential. Yeah, so here it used this term, fast ride, free ride, to show that China's rapid development project is the driver of global economy. And this free ride also appeared in many other cases. And here is just another example. It basically says it also allows Asian countries to take free ride with China, which might reshape Asian economic structure and will greatly promote China's relation with relevant countries, right? So this basically says China's BRI is a benefactor in Asia, allowing Asian countries to take advantage of the opportunities China provides. So in overall, like it just provides this China as a very benign actor internationally, trying to benefit the world and so on. Okay, so the last part of the analysis I would like to show is the macro level analysis, which is the socio-cultural analysis. And here, after we analyze all the articles on BRI from 2014 to 2019, we notice a sharp contrast, kind of somewhere kind of between 2016 to 2017, there's a shift. So in the first part from 2014 to 2016, first of all, the articles kind of tend to focus on persuading Chinese people how BRI would benefit China. So it's presented as a project which would kind of inject new energy to develop Chinese kind of underdeveloped region and so on. And later on, these kind of discourse are disappearing. Instead, you see more that the government, the state media started to emphasize that this is a project which would benefit other countries. So it focused on other countries' interest more from 2017. And this is, of course, not a kind of out of nowhere, because as you might have noticed, BRI have also faced a lot of international criticism about how China is trying to use it to just for its own interest. And that's why from the officials to the academia to the media and so on, there is this shift to try to persuade people inside and also outside of China that no, it's not just about China's interest and is about the kind of the global interest. And another thing is that you notice this kind of a shift from nationalism to cosmopolitanism, which is kind of connected to the first point I just mentioned. So at the beginning is about China's interest, so we can say is an interest-based nationalism. And later on, it mentions a lot about this is about the kind of the common destiny of all humankind and so on. But interestingly, this kind of cosmopolitanism appeared a little bit too sudden, so which would make people question like its genuine kind of genuosity or something like that. And so it sounds more like actually a pride-based nationalism. It's another form of nationalism, just that this time is not about China's interest. It's about that China is a strong country which has the ability to benefit the world. And in this way, using this kind of rhetoric also can gain support from Chinese people, the nationalists at least, because they are happy to see that China becoming such a benevolent world player, which can actually replace maybe to some extent the position of America in leading the international world. Okay, and the last thing I would like to mention about the shift is that some kind of concept or word term shift from BRI as a strategy to BRI as an initiative. So So Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, this I, right, stand for initiative. So at the beginning, it was actually not called initiative. In Chinese, it's just 一带一路. It doesn't have a word strategy, 战略, neither 倡议 initiative. But because the word strategy kind of gave people the feeling that it's more political, more military maybe, and is more aggressive. So from 2016, 2017, there's a kind of official consensus that the English translation should be initiative. It should be a 倡议 instead of strategy. Yeah. So initiative kind of implies that it's more inclusive, right? So it's a project we're doing together. It's still evolving. We don't know how it will look like, but we are doing it together. Yeah. And so as you can see the number, like in 2014, from 2014 to 2016, the word strategy appeared 28 times, but initiative only appeared 5 times. And then from 2017 to 2019, the word initiative appeared over 100 times, 122 times, but the word strategy appeared only 6 times. Yeah, so you see this very clear shift. So just to conclude, I guess it's kind of clear now after this 3 level of analysis. You see how the state media, the party media, use a combination of emotional and linguistic tactics to shape public discourse. So emotional is like how it kind of steered the nationalist emotions among Chinese people, and the linguistic tactics, as I showed you, using all these metaphors, the playful language, and so on, to talk to the young readers, to the public, and so on. And it is a kind of populist style that speaks easily to the collective. We can understand as the people who embrace a simple patriotism, and so this takes up a big portion of the population in every country, and it also represents an offensive move, I would say, from the Chinese official media, from being merely reactive to the public discourse to being proactive. And so in this case, it is a clear example how the state media try to take up the public space, try to guide the public discussion, and so on. Yeah, so I guess I will stop here, and I'm looking forward to your questions and so on. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Runya. Very interesting lecture. I am looking if there are any direct questions from the audience. There was one direct question, though I think it's a bit wider. Maybe even very wide, is how does the BRI incorporate into the worldview of the leaders of the CCCP? Did this worldview change in the past 10 years? That's probably a very big question. But maybe also I would also add, because you already mentioned the shift that both in the use of language, and you already mentioned that that one potential reason is the kind of an international backlash against or criticism against the Belt and Road Initiative. But do you think there are also other factors playing a role, also domestic factors, that, for example, that also within China there was a different, let's say, mood or public opinion changing there? Maybe to connect these two things.
Okay, thank you very much. I will, briefly address both questions. So first of all, whether how is BRI linked to the word will of the leader, and whether it has changed in the past 10 years. I would say it definitely has a lot to do with the ambition of the leader. Yeah, such thing. It's hard to imagine actually during the whole one period. Yeah, so Xi Jinping as a very ambitious political leader, like that's basically his his design. Let's put it that way, right? Yeah. So it's of course very hard to comment on what his word will would be, but at least he expressed in many occasions that he kind of hope that or believe that China should step into the center of the international world and should start to kind of being a more responsible leader as a big country or something like this, right? And so I would say there is actually such a change, basically from 1970s, let's say, like from Deng Xiaoping period, there's always this strategy or this thinking in China of hiding its not hiding, but how to say, like not to actually being too aggressive or assertive in the international stage, just focus on its own development and don't try to take the lead in anything. But as you can see, it's definitely has been a bit different these days. Yeah. About your question, Peter, about the shift, whether it has something to do with domestic factors. Yes, the answer is certainly yes, it has something to do with the domestic sentiment towards BRI. So, as I said, that China really has spent a lot of money on this project, and it has been big news, right? On the CCTV, on the official newspaper all the time. And even though there are a certain level of censorship in China, so it is not very, let's say, convenient to criticize the party state program. But you see some discussions among academics, or in think tanks, about the necessity of doing such a project. Yeah, so I think in this sense, like the government really is trying to justify, in different ways, like how this is a good project. Yeah, it's also to persuade maybe some liberal thinkers in China, liberal intellectuals. They are not nationalists, so you cannot persuade them such thing by saying that it benefits China, right? So they would be maybe more likely to be persuaded, and if they also believe that this is something beneficial to the world and something like that. So you see how the party media is trying different strategy to persuade different type of people in this kind of context. Yeah, and that's kind of a short answer.
Solveig, do you?
Yeah, so thank you for your lovely lecture. It was really insightful, and I have two quite different questions. So one question I thought was really interesting, especially on how you were talking about how people, or this kind of encouragement for the public to participate within the kind of production of the narratives. And this reminds me of things like, for example, like I'm a slight fan of Wang Yibo, and like how he, as an actor, he's part of Untamed, which is this like TV series that is based off of this queer like fan fiction or like internet fiction novel. But the reason why it became so popular, also internationally, but it was because also the fans participated in creating further content that then hooked on more people and created this whole new world for it. But of course, he's also been extremely popular with what he is saying, especially pro-state rhetorics and all of these kind of very nationalistic but very catchy ways of performing and creating a culture around this. So I guess I'm just curious over if you could comment on that, but then also like maybe tangentially about this boom in wuxia and this imagination of, of course, like a very long time scale, and this dynastic kind of imagination, maybe on par with the Belt and Road, and to see like if you have seen like a big change in that imagination recently, and why it's so. I mean, not only why, but how it's become utilized within this rhetoric.
Okay. Thank you. So for the first thing about this interactive feature in the Xia Gedao's production and so on. Yeah, you're very right. It certainly corresponds to all the commercial trend in being more interactive to attract the audience and so on. Yeah, so that's exactly the thing I would like to point out, and how, let's say, how trendy the official media can actually manage to be, right? So it certainly observed this trend of how like all this in the entertainment industry and so on, they also, the audience are not satisfied with just being excluded and then just being the audience just to watch, right? And also so the official media, like following the paramount leaders guidance, and they try to reform itself and to resemble the successful kind of commercial play, right? Yeah, of the game. Yeah, so this is fascinating to observe. And another thing about the wuxia imagination, I'm not sure I understand you right, but I guess what I would like to say is that wuxia has certainly been very popular in China, as I mentioned earlier, that Jin Yong's wuxia just have the appeal to attract both the highbrow reader and the lowbrow reader. So in this way, if you want to make a political program looks appealing to the mass, and this is a good way to go, right? Yeah, so you use some of the terms from them, and actually Xia Gedao is, of course, it has a lot of other articles. It's not just on Belt and Road Initiative. It's just a case study I selected, like articles on Belt and Road. But Xia Gedao itself is just a public account from People's Daily commenting on everything. Yeah, but to make themselves popular, and they choose this wuxia name, and also to name themselves the writers in this kind of figures and so on. So yeah, that's very clever. It's a very clever way to go, and yeah, and it's really hard to find any Chinese reader who will say I don't like wuxia, right? Yeah. So yeah, that's basically the approach they took. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. There's another question from Adrian, and in your view, it's wrong to assume that authoritarian regimes relied mainly on hard propaganda. But do you think that authoritarian regimes, especially China, mainly as a reaction to the rise of digital technologies, started to use more populist way to convince their subjects of their policies? Was not the whole Mao era an experimentation with popular and, quote, native ways of propagating the CCP's ideology?
So whether it is kind of a new Maoist approach to involve the public or something like that?
As I would understand it, the question aims more probably at that already in previous times these more populist forms of engagement were taking place rather than hard propaganda, between brackets. I don't know if you want to comment on that or can answer.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. I mean, I think for people who understand China, who are familiar with China, the history and so on, then it is clear that the Communist Party doesn't only use hard propaganda to communicate with people. But if you look at the kind of, first of all, maybe a lot of the, let's say, like not China watchers, maybe some just people who are not so familiar with China. China is still seen as a communist country, like very communist, like socialist country, and so that's, I guess that's the thing, the myth I would like to debunk. Yeah, so as you mentioned at the beginning, there are a lot of still stereotypes and misunderstandings from the public about this mysterious country, I guess. Yeah, so that's kind of react more not to, I would say, the China watchers or China researchers. It's more about talking to like lay people, let's say, about like what is actually going on inside of China. Just as Andrea has mentioned, like actually during Mao time, there are already a lot of this kind of strategy. Of course, it's not digital, but Mao certainly uses a lot of populist approach, to connect with people. Another thing is that while writing this article, I also noticed that the literature on populism, especially digital populism in authoritarian context, is very little. And most of the time, this concept is used to discuss the political communication in democratic context. So that's kind of also shows that when people talking about digital populism, their first reaction is that, oh, this is more like a democratic thing. It's not, in the red China or in the authoritarian country in general. So that's, I guess, it's another perspective I would like to bring in the academia world at least, and to show that we actually also should use this word to understand what is going on in China.
So I have another question, if that's okay.
Sure.
So you mentioned this new cosmopolitan, like Tianxia, I assume. And I guess I'm really curious also to hear, because from what I know, it's this kind of cosmological and moral order, which is committed to this community of a shared future, especially related to like the emperor, especially under the common sky, which slightly relates to governance. So I can see how, I guess this ideology is trying to be mobilized with the Belt and Road, but I'm curious as to why you said it was too sudden. And also how, I guess, is this because it was too vague, or I guess I'm just curious as to why you said it was too sudden. Maybe to expand more on this, what is this new cosmopolitan, especially beyond China?
Thank you very much for this question. I guess I didn't clarify it enough. the second part, I guess, is not the 天下. 天下, as we all know, is an ancient term, right, from Chinese culture, Confucianism culture. The second part is the focus on talking about other countries' interests. And also this term that 人类命运共同体 didn't appear at the very beginning of the project. So in 2013 and 14, you actually didn't see much talk of this term, right? But it only appeared later on in 2000, I think it appeared in late 2015 or 2016, and then the party media started to take up this term. So as I showed in the table, the number, right? So suddenly, like, it's very much about a common initiative, right? So it's for the benefits of the whole world. Yeah. So that's why we kind of feel this shift is a little bit sudden. But I totally agree that this concept of 天下, which is related to the idea of cosmopolitanism, is not sudden at all, and it has a very long history. And I guess also because this term, especially for China's neighbors, are quite threatening. Yeah, so they are not necessarily happy to be included in such a system, even though 天下 in the Chinese philosophers' understanding is a very benign system, but its neighbors doesn't necessarily agree with that, right? So this term actually is not used very common in the official language. Yeah, so they tend to use this kind of the destiny of the common human being, something like 人类命运共同体, these kind of new terms, yeah, to interpret what is going on.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I think there are no more direct questions from the audience, but if other questions would come in, we can still relate them later. But thank you, Runya, again for your very interesting talk. I would propose we move on to Solveig's lecture performance, and on that I will the lecture is a pre-recorded video that I will stream now over Zoom. And we also put it temporarily on YouTube, but just in case there are any problems with the latency, because we want to be able to, for you to see it in best quality. So the link will also be posted in the comments on YouTube and in the description for those who are not registered at the moment. Solveig, is there any one sentence you want to say before, or?
Not really. I mean, I think this lecture performance kind of came out of the AAA Cargo, the film that I produced made in 2018, along with several collaborations that followed it. So yeah, enjoy.
And whether you watch on YouTube or on the separate link, we then meet here again in discussion in I think 31 minutes. And enjoy the lecture performance. I will start streaming it here now.
Every year during late winter and early spring, atmospheric pressure dips over the two deserts of Taklamakan and Gobi, feeding into the strength of the westerly winds. As they interface with the eroding landscapes, its sand and loose topsoils are picked up, transitioning into the air and into a dust storm. In April and May earlier this year, a storm started, sweeping around areas of southwestern Xinjiang, covering cities including Aksu, Kashgar, and Hetian in its heavy yellow dust. Disruptive for the eyes, visibility was down to 5 meters in some parts of the storm. The particulate matter delayed trains traveling along the Belt Road for several days. People were forced to take shelter indoors, and all the flights out of Aksu and Kucha were cancelled, including 48 flights later cancelled in the capital, Beijing. Activities froze as sand threw place into a turbid haze. The dust storm has become an annual occurrence, compared to half a century ago, when each phenomenon struck only once every 7 or 8 years. The sands are close reminders of expanding deserts from the nation-state's peripheries, Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia. The Hewlett-Packard-initiated railroad speeds through the growing deserts in its regions, where the optimization of commodity movements are paired with the spatial designs, whose best interest is to partake in the slowing of the desert. As the deserts expand roughly 1,300 square miles a year, each grain of sand carries the potential to be thrown across thousands of miles with the storm, riding air currents sometimes as far as California, blind to jurisdictions. Today what I will be speaking about is this rough area, of both the spaces to which a railroad cuts through, mostly across Xinjiang, but also the atmospheric stream which flows interfacing it. The winds form a big part of how the land behaves through the desert spaces of the Taklamakan and Gobi. The Taklamakan spreads across the province of Xinjiang, which is an autonomous region covering an area bigger than France, Germany, and Spain put together, sharing borders with Mongolia, Russia, Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, and India. In 2014, the American tech company Hewlett-Packard had made an agreement with the Chinese state to initiate the construction of a rail line. Most of the goods transported through this route are from multinational IT companies whose manufacture is situated in Chongqing, central China. This is followed by a move made by the company, as well as many others including Foxconn, who supplies Hewlett-Packard, Acer, Apple, and Volkswagen, to shift their factories towards China's western border. So in this talk, I will follow this rail route, most specifically in western China, and look at it across distinct scales. The scale of the frontier space, well, I'll speak about the state-led development across western Chinese territories. To the scale of the special economic zone, which forms as replicable spatial technology that brings outside markets inside state spaces. The global scale of Hewlett-Packard and their logistical innovations across times and transnational space. And the closer lens of the railroad itself, which cuts across Xinjiang, looking at Hewlett-Packard's involvement in the Belt and Road Initiative. I will be using scale as method, sensitive to how scale has been mobilized within these processes I describe, where fundamental differences made at levels such as inventory lists scale up to matter in very physical, cartographic, and temporal cognitive ways, but also to gesture towards what Gabriel Hecht describes as a multiscalar approach, where I'll be guided by the dust storm as interscalar vehicles, blurring the outline scales not only narratively but also materially, pulling into relations times and spaces which have long been kept separate.
就是，那这4周你们在这儿，有地种啊，地不多，我看果树
地没多了，没多少地了，对，都是树了，没多少地了。你没看现在原来这库区里头可以种啊，这库区里头可以种，现在都不容易种，都绿化上了，你们都全栽上树了，没多少地了，几乎上没多少地，就有点树了。
好像北京那个规划最后就是地让它少。
In this clip, you can hear my uncle ask the guard of a satellite ground station about the massive shift in the use of land surrounding the area of Miyun outside of Beijing. The guard, who is also a farmer, notes the need to plant trees, converting agricultural ground into rows of poplar trees. They continue to discuss how these trees are part of the 3 North Shelter Forest Program, a large-scale state-led civic movement combating desertification and controlling dust storms. The program enforces the collective planting of forests aimed to hug the deteriorating soil onto the ground while offering cash incentives to farmers to plant trees and shrubs in areas that are more arid. Political and scientifically driven rhetorics of warfare are mobilized against the encroaching desert, with monocultures of shrubs and trees serving as windbreaks from dust storms. The program started in 1978 and is planned to be completed around 2050. Forests now cover more than 500,000 square kilometers, turning it into the largest artificial forest in the world. These rhetorics follow a familiar chorus, where during the 1960s, Xinjiang's desert regions have been one of the first areas to be militarized and industrialized by Mao Zedong's programs in order to prepare urgently for war with the Soviet Union as they clashed in border regions. My collaborator and art historian Azia Bazreva describes this othering of the changing climate on par with the othering of populations, particularly following the Soviet legacy of the binary enemy, the rhetorical other to fixate on. The clips you are now watching are from Spring in the Desert, produced in 1975, and The Army's Reclamation and Battle Song, produced in 1965. Both films show the educated youth from China's interior provinces that were sent to carry out large-scale development projects to remote places, grand greening projects constructed in the otherwise backwards and famine-stricken Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia. They chronicle a population of Chinese Han ethnic minority whose ambitions lie in the building of dams and farms in the desert and barren land, sidelining the local ethnic minorities in the margins. Where previously yellow sands surround the landscapes, now green waves roll across them like the ocean. Distinctive patterns of colonialism were encoded within this modernist project of the communist regime in China, with the scale of the frontier being crucial in defining nationalism. Through the sanitized rhetoric of engineering, the shaping of the physical environment, land was cleared and people dispossessed from place, sowing plantations and catering to extractive activity. Sheldon Liu and Hao Minggong describe colonialism to be performed in the act of sinicizing the minorities through the greening of ethnic borderlands. Justifying their presence through these projects allowed for the enveloping and the displacement of the indigenous populations within the modernist project of the People's Republic of China. This also entails a dismissal of indigenous knowledge and forms of relating to their land, where the Uyghur ethnic minorities had previously used an extensive network of kares, a localized technique which had irrigated these arid areas. This new extractive vision of the frontier space was fundamentally incompatible with these practices which had gone for millennia. Throughout that time, over the past few decades, utopian social agricultural experiments of high Maoist socialism have completely drained groundwater and many lakes across Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia. These operations and their dried out beds became key sources for the annual dust storm. Atmospheres and geologies continued to be posed as an engineering problem until this day. Anthropologist Jerry Zi writes on Chinese governance as the programming and modulation of more than human processes, which becomes apt while considering the social, botanical, market, aeolian, and political processes as manipulable components of an environmental machine. The designs of desert spaces into crosshatches of forests are supported by countless laboratory experiments involving computer modeling and wind tunnel tests, where these models and tests siphon the dispossessed and colonial histories as unquantifiable data provenance of no use value.
我们停下，看着罗布泊的地貌。他指着散落在各处的巨大岩石说：“这里以前肯定有过水。”沙海，沙子组成的海，海洋一词的新前缀。沙漠中的沙子在风中徜徉，聚集变成沙丘，然后像缓慢流动的液体一般移动。大地吞噬着大地。
In 2014, Hewlett-Packard had made an agreement with the Chinese state to initiate the construction of a rail line. Their agreement was defined not according to business logic, but, quote, also with certain strategic calculation, end quote. Saving 2 weeks' worth of transportation time, it was faster than slow ocean, cheaper than air freight. The rail route from Chongqing cuts through Xinjiang province into Kazakhstan, Russia, Belarus, and Poland before reaching its destination in Germany, 11,180 kilometers later. It was seen to be an alternative to the Pacific Ocean route, which was filled with choke points and perils. One can link the Hewlett-Packard rail route and the later Belt and Road Initiative as a continuation of the state-led Go West campaign, where since the year 2000, heavy industries and corporate manufacturing facilities have been encouraged to move inland and westward to thrust the great development from the vibrant East Coast into the poorer regions through a controlled and loosened economic climate. This was a state-led movement into the energy and resource-rich regions, towed under a rhetoric of the redistribution of wealth. Whether by long-distance connections to the industrial zones of the East Coast or consumer demands from exterior to the country, strategies of zones of exception and logistics have become intrinsic in its generative and segmented territorial remaking. More speed and less cost of transporting Chinese-made goods to Western markets, large incentives allowed transnational corporations like Hewlett-Packard to leverage the situation in their favor. The Hewlett-Packard-initiated rail route later became part of the Chinese state's framework of the Belt and Road Initiative in 2015. The route marked the beginning of a cascade of a now 5-continental mega-infrastructural project called the Belt and Road Initiative, developing telecommunication cables, railways, dams, power stations, providing the funds and labor force to implement these projects predominantly with a Global South alliance, where now $1,200 billion worth of Chinese construction firm contracts are made over 60 countries. Since Xi Jinping's presidency in 2013, the catchphrase used amongst planners of the Belt and Road Initiative was 有外之内, which means bringing the outside in. The logic of bringing outside inside can be thought through China's signature technology of special economic zones, with how the export process economy driven by transnational capital enters into the space of state-controlled economy inside the system. Deregulated environmental and labor laws offer legal independence from the domestic laws of the host country through the creation of these zones, allowing for cheap labor and the allure of tax incentives, allowing for further transnational collaborations. Aiwa Ong writes that within the Chinese communist state system, zoning technologies are devised as a distinctive way to re-territorialize national socialist space while generating a controlled development of capitalism. These zoning technologies are designed to recast geographies of law and violence through the rearranging of the inside and outside of state space. Actions like military occupation, land grabs, and dispossessions are all part of this technocratic territorial reconfiguration.
我们沿着新丝绸之路进入到这座以乡里和最近刚刚发现的石油著称的城市中，几乎没有多少人住在这里，但是建筑依旧在建造中。当他被一个看门的拦住后说道：“他是河南来的吧？或者是山西？”他们互相点头表示同意。
哎，那个有个前些日子我看那个微信上有一个视频，就是他说是到欧洲的，那个货车，怎么那么长啊？那是真的吗？
真的。
那几乎我见好像有3个车头2个车头
啊，一下挂50来60。
对，时间特别长啊！你看他做了一个转弯的一个镜头，速度太快了。
我们这车站还是不是很忙的。你要碰上那个大山，那北疆奎屯大山口，那整个跟码头一样，跟
山口出境的往俄罗斯往欧洲走的那个特别多。
那个地方都没有空地方，全是货啊，那忙的啊，就跟港口一样啊，都集中到那儿。
你看这是集装箱拉过来的嘛？
我们就用就这样的集装箱啊，这是能40吨的，60吨的大集装箱、小集装箱，
那个海运那个箱，
一下就一列，就直接就走了，装完以后直接就走了。你到哪一个英国、德国、法国，直接就走1个列就走了，直接上口岸上装船。
有机会你就看看这个像那车过去了，货车你在那等着，你看那货车，你数一下那个有多少节。
欢迎致电淘宝消费者服务热线，退款、售后维权、卖家请按1，账户问题如注册、密码、登录等请按2，商品挑选、货款、服务查询请按3，中奖真假确认、请按4，支付宝业务请按5，商家业务请按6，手机请按4号。
To revisit what I had first described Hewlett-Packard's reasoning for their decision to co-initiate this mega infrastructural project, defined, as they said, not according to business logic, but also certain strategic calculation, and to question why a tech company like Hewlett-Packard would be interested in the building of an actual train line in the first place, which goes beyond their scopes of creating IT infrastructure and products, but also to include now the hegemony over the entire transnational distribution route. In the 1970s, firms in the industrializing global north were experiencing a downturn in profits due to the rising costs of production and wages, and sought cheaper production costs elsewhere. Professor of Global Studies Charmaine Shua outlined the pattern that the answer was to return to older colonial modes of production, where seeking extraction and cheap labor sources internationally allowed for profit value to be reaped in the north while offshoring production to the global south. In post-war Japan, Toyota pioneered supply chain management by moving production outside of their sovereign borders, coordinating space and time through a more cost-beneficial manner. As a flexible production technique, just-in-time management aimed to shave off expenses and optimize, where possible, through various methods of tweaking. Hewlett-Packard was the first Western company to incorporate Japan's pioneering industrial methods of supply chain management. This technique standardized a rhythm of labor throughout the production line, with working hours described by Stefano Harney as a killing rhythm of labor. It globalizes an acceptance of working the body at a rate which physically and mentally destroys it over time. Just-in-time management pioneered a rationalization which seeks calibration of work throughout the whole body of the supply chain. Efficiency is implemented through the different scales within stratas of inventory lists to political economic agreements along the Hewlett-Packard Railway. Thousands of laptop computers are piled neatly and sealed in shipping containers to travel across the rail route between Chongqing and Duisburg 3 times a week.
在这里，交界线开始变得模糊，可能连到了波兰、白俄罗斯。事物之间有多近，是由参量定义的，指令、争议、意见、收益、关系，或者道路的改变。
Borders have also shifted, with the train route's security check displaced, fulfilling ambitions of free trade. Goods were allowed to travel uninterrupted through Russia, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. Hewlett-Packard had also negotiated with the Chinese government to implement their own border customs software for processing documents and permitting its containers to instead stay locked and uninspected at border crossings en route. This allows for the inclusion of cargo inspection, quarantine, and customs clearance to occur all in one stop, installing a new framework of transnational regulation, security, and labor management, along with standardized units across platforms. In these digital spreadsheets and inventory lists, bodies and environments of distribution disappear across transnational spaces, giving the imaginary of naturalized, seamless flow without even needing to take notice.
"金露露啊，快到没时间做梦。他感叹道，向苹果手机里蓝绿色的深渊投去一笔，手指灵动地按触在一旁回荡。亲爱的，您有新的货品到了。亲爱的，今日您将收到一份礼物：美白牙齿、脱毛、增发、新上市的电子产品、高质货品，保你好心情。加盟商业、KTV、舞蹈、教学、推广、生意、娱乐120个国际群，包月仅1490元。我们在一片虚无的疆土上慌忙穿行，脚下踩着的界面瞬息万变，地名无关紧要，历史纪念弥漫不清。新丝绸之路在别处铺就，留下的是一串串待完成的商寮，一块块合成的废墟和满眼像素般的沙石。
personas and ghost murmurings, from risk assessments, weather monitoring, credit ratings, your next possible purchase, his favorite color, feedback into concrete, metal, security, boundary-forming protocols, building a synchronization of histories which sediment into the discursive infrastructures we find ourselves in. An endless doubling effect. It hides the idea that the sedimentation of right here is built of elsewheres. Xinjiang has become one of the most monitored areas within China. An algorithmic oversight of the rail line operates by feeding data through numerous types of radio systems, inventory histories, and the Internet of Things, which in turn translate back into risk assessments and security protocols, which inform management procedures. The rail route and other Belt and Road projects traverses terrains which are amongst the most affected by climate change, with its long-distance infrastructures needing to be designed in ways to withstand increasingly erratic weather events. The railway required 300 miles of windproof walls to shield it from gales in the Gobi Desert, to be able to go with such speed with the force of the wind. Rows of grass, bushes, nets, and stones all form a risk management scheme against the force of wind and the phased transition of desert into storm. One does not have to look far to see that the flow of goods and capital entails an arresting of movement for others. Since the development of this rail line and the broader Belt and Road Initiative, the faster trade through these overland lines meant more enforced restrictions for the Uyghur minorities and members of other Turkic Muslim minorities. In 2016, they were told to hand in their Chinese passports to local authorities for examination and management, where the area had been heavily policed for forms of separatist activity. This also includes daily identity and mobile phone screenings, Wi-Fi sniffers, cars with compulsory tracking devices to 1 meter of resolution made available through satellite imagery. Since 2017, more than 1 million people have been disappeared into re-education camps. And in the following years, a government-led labor transfer scheme enforcing Uyghur prisoners from these re-education camps into the very factories of Hewlett-Packard as workers, factories which also include Acer, Apple, Volkswagen, and Foxconn, amongst many other international companies. A carceral continuum between labor camps and supply chain capitalism. Deborah Cowan writes that the neoliberal management of life and death and its anti-political calculations, cost-benefit analysis, and market-driven logics embed themselves in the most minute of measures. Time and space are designed with technologies of efficiency and standardization, eliminating resistances, including for political claims or ruptures. The management and security of the life of the whole supply chain is crucial, not just the population it serves. It comes as no surprise that Hewlett-Packard had not only acted complicit across the supply chain territories, but have been actively designing and providing the hard and software supporting racial discrimination policies not only in China, but also for Israel's military occupation of Palestine. As laptops and computer screens distribute to Western markets, sandstorms stubbornly move eastwards. These displaced sands have too become products manufactured as an accumulation of soil degradation, labor practices, atmospheric sways, political ideologies, and geological grinds. The contemporary dust storm moves through a series of chemical transformations where during their long-range transport, its particles collide with bacteria, gases, and coagulate solid particles. The dust mixes with pollution aerosols, such as industrial soot, toxic materials, and acidic gases, as it travels over China's heavily industrialized zones. Particulate matter is then scattered, congealed into a whole new series of constellations, embroiled with manufactured and chemical residue. They collect the corporate afterlives of the unevenly distributed ravages remnant of high-carbon industrial practices, extractive economies, settler colonialism, bringing a sense of environmental uncanniness when modernity is materially readdressed with the unintentional consequences of its own grand designs. The landscape is not a background. Instead, peripheral deserts appear inside metropolises of Beijing, Seoul, California, where frontiers become centered. Memories of malpractices, toxic fingerprints, and suspended futures fold into each other and reproduce through toxic constellations. By re-evaluating each scale which is deployed within this rail route, from the frontier spaces with wars waged against growing deserts, to the spatial technologies of special economic zones bringing outside markets in, the scale of the whole body of the Hewlett-Packard supply chain, to the closer lens of the corporate and state railway collaboration. Together they compose a lattice of violent relations that sustain the modern state of China and international markets. The calculations for speed and the least amount of resistance across the supply chains of corporate entities such as Hewlett-Packard exceeds into biopolitical control of the local Uyghur population and increasingly strange weather. Although the design and engineering of immediate time and space, the long-term delayed effects of industry and capital form what Rob Nixon would call a temporal disjuncture, a dislocation of causal relations across space, leading to geographies of concealment occluding troubled relations within transnational space. Attending the politics of these uneven processes which move beyond dualities of the visible and invisible, and instead take messy shapes across multiple scales, not easily resolved in existing vocabularies, this is also where I see tasks for the filmmaker, writer, storyteller, to find other optics which cultivates the relinking of intimate histories and ongoing future presence between colonialism, capitalism, and modernity.
Thank you so much for the lecture performance. I will check if any questions were asked to. Probably some people are still watching the other links, so maybe wait, give them a minute or so. To compensate for the signal delay between all this infrastructure.
Yeah, no problem.
So maybe I can start with a quick question.
Yes, please.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a really strong documentary, artistic and so on, and it really perfectly shows behind this kind of dry, or how to say, very structural political discourse, what is behind, how it influenced the people. I missed in the beginning, or I'm not sure whether this was introduced. I just ran to the kitchen to get water and so on. So if I missed it, I'm sorry. Could you introduce a little bit more, when was this documentary made, and right now compared to that time, like for example, the labor camp and so on. So I know that there are some new development. So how is it at this moment compared to what was presented in the documentary?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And just for generally the comments, I feel like exactly like I think I remember like the beginning of when just touching on the topic of the Belt and Road Initiative in around, let's say 2015, 2016, it was so hard to get underneath the rhetoric just because it's so totalizing. But I think it was always through small like encounters or entry points that felt important to go into it. So for example, this one was about the Hewlett-Packard rail line, right? And I went in the summer of 2016 with my two uncles on a road trip from the far west to Beijing, and basically started within Urumqi. And I guess at that time, when I went to Urumqi, I visited a few friends who were Uyghur and spoke to them briefly about their current experiences, especially in relation to the Belt and Road construction. And it just seems like even though it seems to be going concurrently, at least like the construction happens and then a lot of their lifestyles have changed, you know, and they were kind of telling how exactly when a lot of this like increased efficiency, increased speed of having or sending goods outside of the country using this specific route, it happened alongside their mass arresting, or also, for example, their passports were taken away during that same year. They weren't allowed to leave the country. There was a lot more control over their own movements, also, you know, tracking their cell phone activity daily. So there is a very direct relationship between that route and also their mobility. And I guess also the most recent developments was, of course, this increased incarceration and imprisonment of the Turkic population. But also not only that, but there's a working program that directly feeds people within the working camp into the actual factories to construct the same products, such as the Hewlett-Packard's technological products. So I think there are definite shifts, but it's all kind of a continuum, a carceral continuum between what is happening there, but it's also important to note how complicit international companies are with that, and as well as the Chinese state. So again, it's not just a single Chinese problem, but it's a thing that was co-produced internationally.
Thanks.
I also want to have a question concerning, because I found it quite astonishing that not just the rhetorical analogies with settler colonialism, this go west, and how parallel it actually is with, for example, the US or other states where historically that these kind of mechanisms took place. Just that I have the feeling now I have to think it's on the scale almost becomes fractal, because these dynamics replicate at different scales. It's like what you showed and talked about, that basically the engineering changed the landscape, creates different climatic or weather conditions, which in turn for the infrastructure mean more surveillance and new and more engineering, and it's kind of a never-ending loop that is trim that like efficiency or keeping the flow up, but at the same time it becomes like extremely paranoid in the sense that it can only become more and more fine-grained because there will always be an obstacle. Yeah, I don't. It's maybe more a remark than a question, but.
Yeah, I think this is a good point because also, we have to be extremely critical over all of these new green narratives, right? And also especially in what sustainability means in a larger sense. Also, what is supposed to be more efficient, more logistically progressive. What is better for the common good, and this kind of general development rhetoric, because often this kind of seeds from a very biased, racist place as well, especially in the effects that it produces. It completely overturns a lot of environments all around and displaces the problems elsewhere. So I think especially this ideas around how to keep growing for less is already it garners that kind of paranoia and this very calculative way of risk management, which includes not only environments, but also population, right? And of course, this also creates a very strong line between those who can benefit from these designs and those who lose, So yeah, I think what you're talking about is important, especially at this day and age when this is being mobilized so much more.
Thank you. Maybe to pick up on it, it's the feeling that the self-reproduct or the logic of growth, or also of this connectivity through growth and making everything more fluid, more and carving out the geographies and the infrastructure to be able to do so. It's also what you mentioned as bringing the outside in, but at the same time also keeping the other out. That this kind of,
maybe not necessarily out, but also just, controlling, right? So it's like a kind of management of the different streams of flow based on who it's for. But I think again, it's Kelly Easterling spoke about infrastructure in a really nice or eloquent way, where she speaks about how there's always this rhetoric, this imagination, but you have to kind of look or read in between the lines over what something is saying that it's doing and what it actually might be doing. And I think especially within this rhetoric of Hewlett-Packard, efficiency, logistical, streamlining, and smart, whatever is smart. But I think it's important to always look at what are the material effects or embodiments, or what is actually happening on ground, or all these other kind of spaces that come into play to allow that to happen.
Maybe I also have to think about that because it parallels a bit that the imagination connected is not just like Runya also mentioned, and I also mentioned in the introduction of the Belt and Road being so kind of this general container term for a lot of things, and more also like a rhetorical vehicle to propel infrastructural projects, and also leaving it quite open. That it's in itself kind of like a machinic interpretation of that it's trying to clear I had to think about this analogy of this, the map that becomes the world, and this self-replicating loops in how far Belt and Road becomes not then the machine that becomes the world somehow, in a way of thinking. That it has on the one hand such an extreme absurdity to it, but on the other hand also you have the very real effects that it produces, and in how far those effects and implications also then feed back into the, or are being fed back into the mechanisms. It's like, because I think, like as Runya also mentioned with the, okay, there's also a shift, and in the discourse, the strategy is ever shifting as well. And I wonder, like specifically in the case of Xinjiang, where what is the frontier then there? I mean, if it's about the nation state, and that is the frontier of the nation state to ensure that it's stable and effective within the system that is put in place, then where does that stop? That doesn't really have a horizon anymore.
Right. So do you mean like with the, where does the frontier end? You mean, can you elaborate more on that?
In the sense that, as you say, like also the disjuncture between time and space, and that it reconfigures so much that just in time means that somebody in Xinjiang is kept in a place and being and kept in a specific function in a production, incarcerated, and to ensure the political stability of the region and combining it with an economic efficiency, so that the computer that is produced there can move as swiftly to then Western European markets or further on. That's how I understood it with the reconfiguration, that it's about these different timescales that then come to coexist or are adapted for one specific timescale to become as fast as possible.
Yeah.
And that's kind of this very, like you say, very modernist project. But what's the frontier of that speed? It cannot go ever faster.
Yeah, I mean, this is also the catch, right? It continuously needs to go faster, but for less. And I think you see that with a lot of international corporations now, with having to let go a lot of its staff in order to, be more efficient, but then everyone is overloaded with a lot more work. So yeah, I think it's also to note that, like, for example, just in time came from Japan, and also, which is also a very imperialist project, and a lot of the logistical innovations happened with U.S. imperialism within Vietnam itself. And for example, the first shipping container was invented during the Vietnam occupation by the U.S., along with different things like traffic management systems. So it came from a very military origin, and it continues through to these configurations, right? And I think you're right on saying that even just things like border regimes are not necessarily what they were before. They become plurified. The borders has, for example, within this Hewlett-Packard route, has shifted from between the Chinese state and other neighboring countries to, for example, Belarus, depending on what trade agreements are being agreed on, and also what softwares are being used to streamline the security management. So yeah, so for example, that frontier space have definitely expanded in many ways. But I think this is also why, for example, when it feels a bit not counterintuitive, but counter to being able to be counterproductive. If we still think about national borders or nation states in a very traditional way, right? And that actually by being limited to these nation state borders is only going to reinforce this obscurity of this very global nature of capitalism, of this kind of, these forms. And so again, it's like we need to kind of come up with new ways to understand these relationships rather than being still so almost conservative with how we understand geopolitics.
Thank you. There are two questions from the audience. Apart from the ecological disbalance and neo-colonial independencies for many, in the case of forced labor, for example, which are impressively depicted in the video, are there any benefits for residents along the roads? And residents, it's in quotation marks, in the sense, is there also promise or connected to the infrastructure?
Yeah, I think like there was one part of the documentary that you can see that we go into Korla, which is known for pear and oil. And so a lot of, but this is within China, this, I guess, the working class, a lot of people are shifting around to all of these new cities that are being developed along the new Belt and Road. And in general, there is this kind of excitement over being in the frontier space, being in a place where something is about to happen. And I think, especially with, in general, special economic zones or these kind of new cities, there is this general excitement for that anticipation of the markets to come, for the wealth to be coming in. And when going to another special economic zone called the Lanzhou area, which is one of the beginning stops for the route, the Hewlett-Packard route. I mean, this place has been open for a few years, but people are still waiting there, but there's nothing happening. There's this kind of endless waiting almost. And this comes with this whole speculative nature of financial capital as well. So benefits for people, I'm not sure if I can answer that directly, but I guess maybe this more optimistic affect is what I sensed still along many places.
Thank you. There's another question. Thank you for the wonderful video lecture. One question: in the media, the oppression of Uyghurs is mostly presented as being a matter of culture, as in, between brackets, cultural genocide, that is native language, cultural festivities, religion, etc. But have you come across any protests against the marginalization of, quote, local scientific knowledge, unquote, that you mentioned regarding living in and with the desert?
Yeah, I think so. Maybe this is a tangential thought, but something that just came up immediately was about this cultural genocide, which is very true. But also, I think to note is this incarceration of the Uyghur minorities. There's a lot of complicity with also the US Bush regime. And I guess there's a synchronization between the Chinese states and how there's a counterterrorism kind of rhetoric, especially against Muslims, which synchronizes with the Bush regime almost directly, because the ways of handling that was learned directly by the US state. There's a training program within Xinjiang itself that is led by a lot of the people who come from the Bush regime. So there is a direct kind of knowledge transfer of the securitization aspect, which is very US terrorist mentality or regime. But I think to go back to your point about what was it? It was something about acknowledging or protests regarding recognizing more environmental ways of knowing, right, or handling the environment. So of course, like, for example, I mentioned in the talk that there is a dismissal of a lot of the traditional irrigation practices, such as the Kairos system, which is a millennia old kind of way of using underground water and creating crops and things through that irrigation method. So I guess this has obviously also been utilized in many other desert regions, such as the Sahara, where, you know, the way of mobilizing or being nomadic with the land is through navigating this deep water riverways. So yeah, this is definitely part of this. I think this environmental knowledge is definitely folded into what is deemed as cultural genocide, because I think a lot of, well, because these infrastructure projects completely dry out and destroy and dismiss this kind of local ways of knowing, a lot of communal efforts have been focusing on this being folded in as a cultural erasure. So this is a bit of a meandering kind of answer to your question, but.
Thank you. I see if there's any more questions from the audience. And at the moment, I have one. Well, it's also maybe a bit tangential, but that also in the framework, because you asked a question to Runya before about like longer timescales in reference to the Wuxi, I think, and to think about that also in terms of infrastructure, there is the implications of the structure with it, that but also what comes after, and everything follows the route. And then as far as this route is now established, to think about, okay, the internet submarine cables are where the telegraph lines were, follow all the train tracks, and that this gesture of settler colonialism, of putting infrastructure somewhere, it always comes with this myth that the land is empty or doesn't have infrastructure yet. And I wonder also, in light of your appeal at the end of the film or the lecture, whether there's also forms of thinking different about that, of what could actually follow along these lines, what could be the next technologies. But maybe that's again a bit too naively also connected to the Silk Route. But
no, I think, like, you know, you're totally right with like infrastructure, like the afterlives of these infrastructures. Of course, like infrastructures are being put to place, and it can have very imperial effects as to how it's being used, but it doesn't mean that it will always be imperial, you know. But it definitely sets the premise for a lot of how relationships then can be formed, right? So, for example, this rail route completely erased whole towns because of where it cuts through. So a lot of towns who depended on, for example, smaller stops for like trucks to stop by, and you know, businesses through these people who are surpassing their villages. So without that, they completely run out of business, / people have to just leave, you know. And therefore these infrastructures definitely set a specific potential for a future that is very business oriented or business led. But then again, one of the first entry points to this film that was the AAA Cargo film was actually a few informal logisticians that I met on WeChat who at the very beginning of the Belt and Road Initiative had very interesting ways of talking about how to understand the new protocols of the Belt and Road, but then also understand how then to still make informal business alongside of it. You know, so it's still to kind of manipulate it or surpass it or find a way like around it, you know. So even if there's something that feels so totalizing and definite, there's always going to be ways of twisting that around or some like pores within it, you know. So maybe that's something more optimistic to kind of look into. There's always these kind of subversive tactics.
Yeah, and maybe even also at different scales, maybe it also, as a side effect, builds the infrastructure that at one point in time unites Central Asia or so.
That's true. Because I guess like the thing about it is that it does connect disparate people together, right? And different people who work along that route together in a similar way. Yeah.
I'll check, thank you, if there's any more questions. Ask. If you have any more questions for Solveig or Runya, please speak up now in the chat. Otherwise, I would extend my greatest thank you to the both of you, Runya and Solveig. Thank you for the wonderful lectures, and thank you for questions. I will not even try to summarize anything. I think that, but thank you so much, and thank you to the audience, and thank you for your contribution to offer a different perspective on everything that is under this very giant banner of the Belt and Road, and hoping for more or less darker side effects in the future. Thank you, and I will now pass the word to Qiaoan Magda again.
Yeah, also a big thanks from us. It was really insightful and interesting.
Thank you.
Dazu. Ja, genau, danke an alle, die den roten Faden bis jetzt verfolgt haben oder generell ein kleines Stück mitgeschaut haben, für euer Interesse und die Diskussion. Wir hoffen, dass diese Reihe, The Red Thread, einen kleinen Einblick geben konnte zu China und linken Perspektiven darauf. Es wäre natürlich noch viel mehr einzubringen. Die Uiguren sind schon erwähnt worden, Covid dieses Jahr, Rassismen, die auch in dem Zusammenhang wieder prominenter geworden sind, die ganze Sache mit Hongkong, Ökologie und so weiter und so fort. Zunächst machen wir als RG erstmal eine Pause und ich denke aber, dass wir den Faden bestimmt auch wieder aufnehmen werden, seien es vielleicht Einzelveranstaltungen, die ja auch dann wieder verkündet werden über unseren Kanal. Schreibt uns gerne euer Feedback, Anmerkungen, die ihr habt, und wir danken auch nochmal ganz herzlich der feministischen Bibliothek Mona Lisa Leipzig für den nicht nur technischen Support, der Programm Drift und allen anderen Fördermittelgebern sowie allen SpenderInnen.
Genau, wir haben nämlich einen Spenden-Account bei Better Place. Da könnt ihr auch für diese Veranstaltungsreihe spenden. Wir haben einige Fördergeber, allerdings wäre es schön, dann ein wenig Geldfluss zu haben, damit wir auch in Zukunft Veranstaltungen auch kurzfristig realisieren können, und da würden wir uns selber euren Support freuen. Better Place, Red Thread, das könntet ihr einfach durch eine Suchmaschine suchen, und ansonsten auch hier in der Beschreibung des Videos seht ihr das auch, den Link dazu.
Ja, also
vielen Dank, Solveig und Runya und Peter. Und ja, wir freuen uns und hoffen, dass es nochmal aufgenommen wird, ja, der gute Faden.
Wir denken ja. Dann aus.
Just one thing to also translate it again. We hope to, how do you say it, continue to spin the red thread a bit further in the future. Thank you again, and I wish you all a nice evening.
Und ein schönes neues Jahr, in the Happy New Year. Was ist Büffel?
Yeah.
What's the name in English and in Mandarin? The animal. Büffel. Das Jahr des Büffels beginnt, oder?
The year of the buffalo.
No.
Yeah, I was muted, sorry.
Yeah, so now talk.
Yeah, either cow or buffalo. We just say new. So what kind of new? Doesn't matter.
Yeah, we hope it's a good one.
Yeah, let's keep our fingers crossed.
Has to be a good one.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thank you for the time. Have a nice evening still, and yeah, hope to continue the conversation after.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Leute, kurzes Feedback. Ich höre euch nicht. Ich höre euch nicht. Ich höre euch nicht.
Ich wusste nicht, ob es noch live ist.